September 6, 1925. A girl was born in a small village called Schoten, in the province of North Holland. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen. No one knew it then. No one could have known it. But this girl, petite, with long dark braids in her hair, would grow up to seduce Nazi officers into the woods and watch them fall to the ground with bullets in their chests. She was 14 years old when she became an assassin. Think about that for a moment. At 14, most teenagers are thinking about school dances and crushes and what they want to be when they grow up. Freddie was learning how to shoot a rifle. She was planting explosives under bridges. She was luring enemy soldiers to their deaths on her bicycle, with guns hidden in wicker baskets. But this isn't a spy thriller. This isn't fiction written by some Hollywood screenwriter. This is real history. This actually happened. And what makes it even more remarkable is that almost nobody knows about her. While the world remembers the male resistance fighters, the generals, the celebrated heroes of World War II, a teenage Dutch girl was operating in the shadows, executing Nazi soldiers with her bare hands and a loaded pistol. She did things that would make grown soldiers tremble. And when the war ended, history nearly forgot her entirely. This is the untold story of Freddie Oversteegen. A story about courage, sacrifice, trauma, and what it really costs to fight evil when you're just a kid. To understand Freddie Oversteegen, you have to go back before the war. You have to understand the family she was born into and the values they held dear. In 1925, the Netherlands was a peaceful country. It had not fought a major war in more than a century. The Dutch were proud of their neutrality. They believed they could stay out of Europe's conflicts through diplomacy and isolation. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. Freddie's father, Jacob Oversteegen, was a construction worker. Her mother, Truus van der Molen, was a woman of fierce convictions. Both parents were members of International Red Aid, a communist organization that fought for social justice across Europe. They weren't wealthy. They struggled. But they had something more valuable than money. They had principles. The Oversteegen family lived on a barge. They lived on the water, moving from place to place. It was an unusual childhood. Most children lived in houses on land. Freddie lived on a boat, watching the rivers and canals of Holland flow past her window every single day. That kind of childhood changes you. It makes you independent. It makes you understand that the world is wider than just your neighborhood. Before the war, even in the mid-1930s, the Oversteegen family was already doing dangerous things. They were hiding Jewish refugees from Germany. Hitler's regime was already persecuting Jews, and word was spreading across Europe about what was happening. Most Dutch families looked the other way. They told themselves it wasn't their problem. The Oversteegens did the opposite. Freddie's mother brought Jewish families into their home. Freddie and her sister Truus, who was 2 years older, learned early that helping people in danger was more important than staying safe yourself. That was the lesson their mother taught them. That was the foundation of everything that would come later. When Freddie was young, she and her sister Truus joined the Dutch Youth Federation, a communist youth organization. They made dolls for children caught up in the Spanish Civil War. Even as a child, Freddie understood that injustice somewhere was her responsibility. That people suffering on the other side of the world mattered. Her parents eventually divorced. It was amicable. Her father even sang a French farewell serenade. But after the separation, Freddie and Truus moved into a small apartment in Haarlem with their mother. The apartment was tiny. Freddie and Truus shared a single bunk bed. They had almost nothing. They wore hand-me-downs. But they had their mother's moral compass. Their mother gave them a rule that would stay with them their entire lives: always stay human. No matter what you do, she told them, never lose your humanity. Never become like the people you're fighting against. Stay human. Then, in May 1940, everything changed. Germany invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940. It was brutal and swift. The Dutch had almost no military to resist with. The government fled to Britain. Within days, the Wehrmacht controlled everything. The Nazi occupation had begun. Freddie was 14 years old. For most Dutch citizens, the occupation meant adapting. It meant keeping your head down. It meant trying to survive. About 90% of the population tried to live quietly, hoping the war would eventually end and they could go back to their normal lives. Some collaborated with the Nazis. Some profited from the occupation. Most just tried to stay invisible. But the Oversteegen family was not most people. From the very beginning, Freddie and Truus began acts of defiance. They printed anti-Nazi pamphlets in their apartment, so loudly that they needed lookouts posted at the windows to watch for police. If they were caught printing those leaflets, they would be executed. It was that simple. Death was the penalty for what they were doing. But they kept printing them anyway. The pamphlets they created had messages like, "Don't go to Germany. For every Dutch man working in Germany, a German man will go to the front." They would paste these warnings over Nazi propaganda posters in the middle of the night, racing away on their bicycles before anyone could catch them. It was dangerous and foolish and brave. They were teenagers committing acts of sabotage against one of the most powerful military forces in the world. Then, in 1941, someone knocked on their door. His name was Frans van der Wiel. He was a commander in the Haarlem Council of Resistance, an underground network of Dutch fighters working to undermine the Nazi occupation from within. Van der Wiel had been watching Freddie and Truus. He had seen their work distributing pamphlets. He knew they were committed. He knew they were willing to take risks. And he had a proposal for them. "We're going to sabotage the Germans," he told them. "We'll use explosives. We might also need to shoot Nazis. Are you prepared to join me?" Freddie was 14 years old. Truus was 16. They looked at each other. There was no hesitation, no fear, no second thoughts. "Yes," they said. With their mother's permission, they joined the Council of Resistance. Their mother gave them only one instruction: always stay human. That instruction would become almost impossible to follow. What followed was a transformation. Freddie and Truus joined a small underground cell operating in and around Haarlem. There were about 7 members total. Freddie and Truus were the only women initially. Later, another woman would join them, a brilliant young law student named Hannie Schaft, who had fiery red hair and a fierce commitment to justice. The 3 of them would become the most effective assassination team in the Dutch resistance. But first, they had to learn. Freddie received military training. Someone taught her how to shoot a rifle, how to handle a pistol, how to aim, how to kill. She learned how to march through the woods silently, how to move without being seen, how to plant explosives, how to time a detonation. Remember, she was 14, 15 years old, still a child in every other way. She still probably had homework. She probably still thought about boys. But she was also learning how to be a soldier in a secret war. The resistance work started small. They would use dynamite to sabotage German infrastructure, bridges and railway tracks that were essential to keeping German supplies flowing to the front lines. Every bridge they destroyed, every rail line they disabled, weakened the Nazi war machine just a little bit more. They also worked to smuggle Jewish children to safety. They would hide them, move them from safe house to safe house, and sometimes help them escape the country entirely. Some of these children were smuggled out of concentration camps. They were literally saving lives while also risking their own. But there was something else happening too. Something darker. Something that would define Freddie's entire resistance career. The Council of Resistance wasn't just about sabotage. It was also about assassination. They identified Nazi officers, SS soldiers, and Dutch collaborators, people who were hunting resistance members and turning in Jews. These were men whose deaths would save other lives. And the council decided that Freddie, Truus, and Hannie should be the ones to carry out those executions. The 3 young women were chosen because nobody would suspect them. That sounds insane when you think about it, but it's true. Nazi soldiers and officers saw 3 pretty teenage girls on bicycles, and they saw no threat. They didn't see assassins. They saw potential romantic conquests. The women used that against them. Freddie Oversteegen became the first of the 3 young women to actually shoot a Nazi soldier. It happened while she was riding her bicycle. There was a target, a Nazi officer or a Dutch collaborator. Freddie had a gun hidden in her bicycle basket. At the right moment, she pulled it out and fired. The man fell. And Freddie rode away, disappearing into the streets of Haarlem like she'd just been on a casual bike ride. No one suspected her. a teenage girl with braids in her hair. She didn't fit anyone's image of an assassin. But the bicycle shooting was just one tactic. The other method, the one that became their most famous approach, was far more elaborate and, in some ways, far more chilling. Here's how it worked. One of the girls, usually Truus or Hanny, would approach a target in a bar or cafe. She would flirt with him. She would smile at him. Make him feel special. Make him think he was lucky. This pretty young Dutch girl was paying attention to him, and he would feel like he'd won some kind of lottery. "Want to go for a walk?" she would ask. "There's a nice forest nearby." Romantic. Of course, he wanted to. Why wouldn't he? He was a soldier far from home, and a beautiful girl was inviting him to take a walk in the woods. They would leave the bar together. They would walk into the forest, away from witnesses, away from streets, away from help. And then, in the darkness between the trees, waiting in the shadows, were the other resistance fighters. Armed. Ready. The walk would not end the way the Nazi expected. The execution would happen quickly. A gunshot. Or sometimes, a knife. And then he would be dead, his body left in the woods where it might not be found for days. Freddie became particularly skilled at this. She had a gift for it, in a horrible kind of way. She could look innocent. She could make the targets trust her. And then, when the moment came, she could execute them without hesitation. Years later, when she was an old woman, Freddie would reveal something that haunted her for the rest of her life. When asked what it felt like to shoot someone, she said, "The first thing you want to do when you shoot somebody is to pick him up." Think about that. Here was this teenage girl, trained to kill, trained to be a soldier. And yet, every single time she pulled the trigger, her instinct was to help the person she'd just shot. To save them. To undo what she'd just done. That impulse never left her. Even decades later, when she was an old woman looking back on her life, she remembered that feeling. Truus sometimes became overwhelmed after missions. She would sob uncontrollably. Freddie would eat her handkerchief, literally chew on fabric, to manage her anxiety before operations. Her hands would shake. They were not cold-blooded killers. They were frightened teenagers who believed that what they were doing was right, and who paid an enormous psychological price for it. Nobody knows exactly how many people Freddie and Truus killed. They never revealed the number. It was a secret they kept until the end of their lives. Some sources suggest it was around a dozen. Others suggest it was more. But Freddie and Truus refused to say. That silence was part of how they processed the trauma. Throughout 1942, 1943, and into 1944, Freddie, Truus, and Hanny operated as a team. They would receive orders from their commanders about who needed to be eliminated. They would plan the operation carefully. And then they would execute it. Sometimes Freddie pulled the trigger. Sometimes Truus did. Sometimes Hanny did. Sometimes other resistance fighters did the actual killing, with the three women serving as the bait or the lookouts or the guides. The Nazis had no idea what was happening. They had no idea that three teenage girls were responsible for the deaths of their soldiers and officers. They were too focused on finding large resistance networks, on discovering underground operations. They missed the small group of teenagers operating right under their noses. But the Nazis did eventually figure out that something was happening. They increased patrols in Harlem. They became more suspicious. They started investigating resistance activities more aggressively. The danger grew exponentially. By 1945, the war was winding down. Germany was losing. The Allies were closing in from both sides. Everyone knew the Nazi regime was collapsing. But the Nazis were also becoming more desperate and more vicious. Hanny Shaft was captured in April 1945. She was carrying underground papers and a pistol on her bicycle when she was arrested. The Nazis tortured her. They wanted her to reveal the names of her fellow resistance fighters. They wanted her to betray Freddie and Truus. She refused. Even under torture, even facing execution, Hanny Shaft refused to give up her comrades. On April 17, 1945, Hanny Shaft was executed. She was 24 years old. She had been fighting the Nazis for years. She had survived countless dangerous operations. And then, just 18 days before the Netherlands was liberated, she was killed. The Nazis called her the girl with the red hair. That's how they referred to her in their records. They never knew her real name. They never knew that she was a law student. They never knew that she was part of a team of resistance fighters that included 2 sisters. They just knew that there was a girl with red hair who was causing them problems, and then she was dead. For Freddie and Truus, Hanny's death was devastating. She wasn't just a fellow fighter. She was their best friend. They had shared everything, the danger, the fear, the moral weight of what they were doing. And now she was gone. Freddie and Truus survived the war. Hanny did not. When the Netherlands was liberated in May 1945, Freddie and Truus came out of the shadows. For a brief moment, they were celebrated. People wanted to hear their stories. Journalists wanted to interview them. They were heroes, people said. They had been brave. But something happened that often happened to young female resistance fighters. The public moved on quickly. Freddie and Truus were not given the same recognition that male resistance fighters received. And more than that, they were communist. The Dutch government was suspicious of communists, even communist resistance fighters. The Cold War was beginning. The Nazis were defeated, but now there was a new enemy. Freddie wanted to live a normal life. She wanted to forget what she had done. She married a man named Jan Dekker, and they had 3 children together. She tried to build an ordinary existence. She tried to be a normal wife and mother in a normal house in a normal town. But she couldn't forget. The ghosts of the people she had killed never left her. Every year on May 4th, Remembrance Day in the Netherlands, Freddie would wake up feeling what she described as a bit of dread. That feeling never went away. For nearly 70 years, Freddie lived with the weight of her past. While her sister Truus became a public speaker, telling their story to anyone who would listen, Freddie chose silence. She worked quietly. She raised her family. She served as a board member on the National Hannie Shaft Foundation, which her sister established to remember their fallen friend. But she rarely spoke about what she had done. She rarely told her story. She wanted people to focus on other things, on the future, on peace, on moving forward. Then, in 2014, something changed. Prime Minister Mark Rutte presented Freddie and Truus with the Mobilization War Cross, a Dutch military honor. It was official recognition from the government that what they had done mattered, that they had made a difference, that history should remember them. Freddie was almost 90 years old by then. It had taken nearly 70 years for her country to officially honor her. Freddie Oversteegen died on September 5, 2018. She was 1 day away from her 93rd birthday. She died in a nursing home in Truus, about 5 miles from the village where she was born. By then, she had outlived her sister Truus by 2 years. She was the last surviving member of the trio that had fought the Nazis as teenagers. At her funeral, people remembered not just her courage, but her humility. When journalists and historians asked her if she was a hero, Freddie always gave the same answer. She would shake her head and say, "I was not a hero. My sister was not a hero. We just did the right thing." Freddie Oversteegen never sought fame. She never wanted to be remembered as some kind of superhero. She just wanted to live quietly and be left alone with her memories. But her story matters. It matters more than she ever wanted it to. When we think about World War II, we usually think about large armies and famous generals and major battles. We think about D-Day and the Eastern Front and the fall of Berlin. But the war was also fought by people like Freddie, by teenagers on bicycles, by young women who seduced enemy soldiers into the woods so those soldiers could be executed, by people who sacrificed their youth and their innocence and their psychological well-being because they believed that evil had to be resisted, no matter the cost. Freddie Oversteegen reminds us that heroism is not about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It's about a teenage girl with braids in her hair who knew that she was probably going to die, and she did it anyway. She reminds us that ordinary people can change history, that you don't have to be a general or a politician or a celebrity to matter. Sometimes all it takes is one person, or 3 teenage girls on bicycles, who decides that they're not going to accept evil, that they're going to resist. And they did. Freddie Oversteegen and her sister Truus and their friend Hannie Shaft changed the course of the war in their own small way. They saved lives. They killed enemies. They stayed human, even when their mother's instruction to stay human seemed almost impossible. That is why we remember Freddie Oversteegen. Not because she wanted to be remembered, but because her story needs to be told. Because history must not forget the teenagers who fought in the darkness. Because we must always remember that courage looks different than we expect. It looks like a 14-year-old girl on a bicycle with a gun in her basket. Freddie Oversteegen died on September 5, 2018. But her story will live forever.